Hey guys, welcome to The Refined Savage. This week on the show, we travel out to the Cleveland Museum of Natural History to talk with Dr. Brian Redmond. Dr. Brian Redmond is an expert on early primitive man, especially in the Ohio region. He's been on some excavations all over Ohio, including not just primitive man, but he's dug up some mammoth and giant sloth and all different kind of cool stuff. So listen up to this real-life Indiana Jones and enjoy the podcast. All right, at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History with Dr. Brian Redmond. How you doing? Welcome to the show.
I'm doing good, Mark.
So we were just having a great conversation on just the fact that we as people are always still looking for that mystery out there. Whether it's like you were talking about giant squids that we later find out are true, or people grasping onto the Bigfoot thing that somewhere out there there's some giant walking around. What was your? I know we were just talking about it, but like the Bigfoot thing. There is some evidence that there was something similar to that at one time. Thousands of years ago, right? The
Gigantopithecus, right? Yeah. Exactly. That was some type of early hominid form that was maybe a branch on the human family tree. That was apparently a really large primate. And they found teeth in Asia that are really large, and they look like primate or almost hominid teeth, and a few other bones. And it did exist, but again, it went extinct thousands of years ago, and there's no modern evidence of that. But some people think perhaps some of those populations survived, and it isn't totally impossible that out in some of the really remote parts of the world, in Siberian forests or in Asia or something like that, you could have a few of these animals. But frankly, we've covered so much of the globe, and everybody now has a cell phone camera.
Sure, right.
And if someone would have seen these, there'd be some physical evidence left behind, like a bone, part of a skull, a jaw, something we could bring forward, and it would be pretty clear it's something undocumented.
Right, yeah.
But it hasn't happened, and people are, again, there are some remote parts of the world still where very few people go. But if it is, then there's only maybe a few of these creatures left, and they're maybe dying out if there even still exists.
So yeah, it was something that I want to believe more than anybody, but
sure. Yeah,
it's like you talked about. It's a very romantic thing that there's still mysteries out there, but science seemingly has done a pretty good job making sure everything's documented and
that's our job, is to deal with the material. Archaeologists they study people in the past, but all we have to work with is what they left behind, the physical things.
Sure.
We can't interview them, we can't talk to them as a cultural anthropologist would do today, going around the world and talking to different societies. So we deal with in this region, in the Midwest, where I specialize, it's the pottery, the stone tools, sometimes animal bone if it's preserved, burned plant remains. That's just about all we find. You think about how rich any of these cultures were and all the material they had, wooden objects, other things made of cloth and textiles, all that's gone.
Gone, sure.
It doesn't last in the temperate forest environment that we live in. And we have a small fraction of what they left behind, and you're trying to make some then reasonable interpretations, inferences about how did these people live.
Right.
And usually we can't get very detailed, but we can kind of get the basics, outlines of how these cultures lived, when they lived, how they changed over time, which is also a big thing that archaeologists want to understand, is not just what a culture was, but how does culture change.
Right. How did you get involved in this to begin with? Was this a passion from when you were younger, or archaeology in general?
Well, when I was a kid, I loved dinosaurs, like kids even do today, and I was interested in things about the past. And then when I got into high school, later in high school, started thinking about a college, major. I was looking at different things. I thought about paleontology, studying fossil plants or animals, and that was of interest. And then I read about anthropology, which is the study of really everything related to humans, whether the physical form, modern cultures, or archaeology. And I got interested in that too, because it touched on so many things. And in school, like high school, I really liked the earth sciences, geology, that type of thing. I liked history a lot. So I kept thinking, well, what would combine, the study of the past, but also look at the material record, what's left behind. I'm one of these people that like to touch things and hold things
I
and
was going
find
to ask
objects.
you if that's still a thrill for you to actually go in there and
Oh yeah.
when you find an object, how amazing is that? I mean,
Well, it is. I
a
mean,
big thrill?
like I said, I've been doing this for over 3 decades. So to find a piece of pottery myself is not as thrilling as it was
Sure.
back in 1978 or something. But my students or the volunteers that work with us in the field get the same experiences
Sure.
too. And then now we can kind of explain more about not just that's a piece of pottery, but maybe about how old it is, and they actually get a richer kind of experience by working with professionals and learning about
Right.
that. So I was thinking about what majors are out there, and I looked more in anthropology. So I decided to start as an anthropology major at the University of Toledo, which is the university I picked to do my undergraduate work. And I'm from Cleveland, so it was nearby. I knew people that went there. And they had a pretty good archaeology program going there. And I wasn't completely set on archaeology because the way it's taught in most universities in this country, archaeology is taught within anthropology. Anthropology is the bigger discipline. It covers all these other subfields, and archaeology is one. And so you learn about all the other subdisciplines and cultural and physical and all these things, plus archaeology. And it wasn't until I really had my first field experience where I actually went out in the field with my professor at Toledo to do a little bit of excavation. He had a project just doing some, they call shovel testing, digging little holes across this metro park in Toledo. They were going to build something, I think, and they wanted to test it and see if there's anything important there before they dig the ground.
Okay, that makes sense.
And that
yeah.
that generates a lot of archaeology, by the way. It's called contract archaeology in this country. But so we went out, we dug, and I remember finding broken glass, rusty nails, just modern junk that got buried over the years or in part of a landfill. And I remember I thought it was the greatest thing in the world.
Right.
I don't know why, it just thrilled me to find these things in the ground. And maybe they were 100 years old, maybe a little bit older. But it's the first time I actually focused and did something like that. And I just remember this was great. And that kind of sold me on archaeology, that subdiscipline. And that's kind of where I've been focusing all through my graduate career and, of course, now.
Yeah, I found an arrowhead once, and it was just just the most amazing thing. You pick this thing up, and I took it to someone and had them, is this an arrowhead or is this just a chunk of stone that just looks like an arrowhead? And they said, yeah, it was probably an arrowhead. And it was just amazing to think that someone had used this and someone had spent a lot of time and energy fashioning it.
Exactly.
And then was using it. I don't know how many kills they got out of something like that, but I'm guessing they reused them and refashioned them. And
they reused them, and then they usually either were lost or discarded if they were like a knife blade that was worn down, or an arrowhead that may have got lost in a hunt or got stuck in an animal and fell out or something. Most people that find artifacts, they find them on the surface of the ground.
Yeah,
by accident.
Yeah, it was just probably something someone walked by 1,000 times and no one noticed.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I can imagine finding stuff like that. We were talking about one of the excavation sites near my hometown, but this seems to be kind of a hotbed of sites. I looked at a lot of your papers, and then we have the mountain culture in southern Ohio, but Ohio seems to be just packed full of these sites.
Yeah, Ohio has a really rich kind of archaeological record and prehistory that we now know goes back at least 13,000 years, probably more than that, but
now,
back to at least the end of the
that?
Ice Age. Well, see, with all these, we really can't put. People always ask me when I talk about this, or an artifact they found. They say, "Well, what tribe is it? Who made it?" And
Right.
I cannot say.
Sure.
And also, I can tell them maybe about how old it is, and maybe what people generally were doing in that time period. And a culture or a tribe is, that's something that would have been known to those people. It probably something that wasn't even existing in the historic period when we had written records. So
probably
all this
wasn't even the same name, because weren't those names we gave them?
Yeah, the ones that are used today, a
Yeah.
lot of those. So that we can't be that specific or answer it to that degree, but we can tell them generally about it. People in Ohio, or different parts of Ohio, what they'll be doing at different times. So, but a lot of people, and most Ohioans that in school learned about the Indians at all, learned about the quote-unquote mound builders, or the mound building people that lived in Ohio. And There's been a couple general names attached to those. One is Adena, A-D-E-N-A, and then Hopewell, which are general terms for a bunch of societies that lived in southern Ohio and some in northern Kentucky and adjacent states, basically the middle Ohio Valley. And they were probably the premier mound building societies, build huge earthwork enclosures just about 2,000 years ago, that time range. And they're very well known across the country. They're closely studied by lots of different archaeologists. There's a lot of interesting aspects of their culture. It apparently was like a really complex religious movement with complex ceremonialism and building these earthen monuments of huge scale down in southern Ohio. And then it kind of just stopped. They stopped doing that around 500 AD or so. And then we had more kind of a movement to modern, what people think about as maize growing, farming Indians living in villages, like the Iroquoian people in New York that people are familiar with, that life way. There's some more your culture change that we look at.
Right.
So they went from small scale farmers and ritualism in the Hopewell period, and then basically moving into something more agricultural in small villages and up to the historic period. But the weird thing about Ohio in terms of trying to figure out a timeline and who was here when is kind of different than most parts of the country in North America, because what we call our prehistory, meaning the time before written records, lasts very long. Like I said, it starts at 13,000 years ago with the first artifacts, up to about 1650 AD. Pretty just a few centuries ago,
Right.
is when the first Europeans came into, let's say, northern Ohio, the French, for example, and traders, and then soldiers who started writing down, meeting Native Americans, writing down who they were. And now we know who a lot of those groups were at 1700, 1750. They have names like the Ottawa and the Wyandot and the Miami, and the Delaware came in a little bit later, the Seneca over in New York. But we know pretty much those named groups are not the descendants of these people that were here from 13,000 years ago. The people we study, who study prehistory, or we actually call it more the pre-contact era now, before European contact, those people apparently left Ohio almost completely by about 1650. They just abandoned
Do we know
the state.
what happened to them?
Well, that's one thing we're trying to understand and work on. We have some theories about what happened at that time around Ohio that probably pushed them out. But the fact that their lineage, their timeline ends, and then there's almost a 100-year period where there's really no permanent settlement by Native Americans in at least northern Ohio and really a lot of southern Ohio, until some of these named groups come back in, like the Ottawa and the Wyandot come in from Canada, and the Miami out from Illinois and places like that. They reoccupy this unoccupied space. And then the Europeans got involved, and goes up to modern history. But it's a real puzzle, and when you think about it, it's only archaeology that tells us anything about these people, because there's not one shred of written evidence about the people that lived here at 1500, right? Or 13,000 years ago. We have to get all that from looking at the artifacts and things, and digging these sites and trying to understand them and build a timeline and what they did over time. So without archaeology, we'd know about the last 200 years, and that's about it.
Yeah.
And we'd know somebody was here before, but we can't really say.
And you're saying 13,000 years ago is when they first, as far as the record shows, got to Ohio, the Ohio area. How and then the prevailing theory, I guess, or fact, whatever it is that we still are looking at people coming across the Bering Land Bridge and then populating down.
Right. There's a couple different scenarios now for how people got here, but yeah, basically it's coming from Northeast Asia, Siberia, northern China area. And now with DNA analysis, they know that that modern Native Americans are descendants of some of these Eastern Asian, Northern Asian groups.
Right.
And that might have come over as early as 15,000 years ago. Now the dates keep getting pushed back. We go up to the northwest coast, up to Alaska and the Bering Straits area. There's some fairly early sites. So one theory, though, was the traditional one, where they during the Ice Age there was a time when sea level dropped and there was a land bridge between Alaska and Siberia, and there was. And the people walked across that, migrated once it opened up, and they came down south into the continental U.S. and down into Mexico and down into South America and populated the whole, New World area in a very short time. But it's funny because geologists and climatologists and others have been pushing back the dates of when the Bering land bridge would have been there. And now it looks like it actually was opened up probably later than we think, and that people did come earlier, but they probably came along the coast in boats.
Okay.
And they were people
Still the same way, still
yeah,
that same direction.
the North Pacific
We're
across
not
the
dealing with people coming across the Atlantic.
yeah. So you had this big coastline from Siberia up towards Alaska and then down to the northwest coast area. And probably a lot of these first people were people that were already living in that area along the coast of Siberia that were already adapted to hunting sea mammals, sea animals, seals and even whales and things like that. And so they didn't have to change the way they lived. They just kind of kept moving as the ice freed up the coastline along these inlets and valleys along Siberia and up towards Alaska, then back down. And just exploiting, if you live off marine resources and kelp and things like that, you can survive perfectly well. You don't have to go inland and build villages and things like that or try to hunt animals. So that's now people think that's more likely for the earliest people to come here. But still, it's the same direction. It's the same idea coming from that area.
And what kind of things were they dealing with when the ones that did cross the land bridge? Are we dealing with, at that period, like the short-faced bear and dire wolves? Is that what we're looking at? I mean, it would have been
once that ice opened up, whether in Alaska or in West Canada or down into the U.S., once they entered into these areas, they would have experienced and interacted with all these, what we think of as extinct Ice Age animals, mammoth and mastodon, and you mentioned short-faced bear and a whole range of species.
Which I've seen like pictures of them recreated. They were just
something
out of a nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, pretty formidable. These are what they call mega mammals. These are big animals, more than 100 pounds, and up to the size of these giant elephant-like animals, the mammoths, and humans would have seen these animals.
Right.
I mean, we know from the timing of, and these earliest Native Americans we call Paleo-Indians, and Paleo just meaning ancient Indians. It's the oldest groups. So these Paleo-Indian people would have actually interacted and seen these animals, probably hunted them occasionally. We don't think they were just eating mammoth all the time.
Right.
Because we don't have enough kill sites. We don't have enough direct evidence that this was an everyday thing. It may have been more opportunistic. Well, if they could hunt a young one or one that was old and sick and they could run it down. I mean, frankly, with wooden spears and flint spear points, you're less likely to go up against a full bull male mastodon in his prime. You probably won't win that battle, and you probably won't kill it.
Right.
People around the world, in the past have hunted elephants in African places, and they know how to do it, and they can do it successfully. But
it's a big risk.
These folks are hunters and gatherers, and they would always have to weigh what's the risk and the payoff of this. And if they don't think they're going to win out, it's not a good bet. So there was lots of smaller game they could hunt too.
So that brings me to one of these that might be a conspiracy type thing, but I looked at one of your papers on the Clovis impact meteor that may have hit.
Oh yeah.
Do you feel that is a more viable explanation for why we had this mass extinction of these large animals as opposed to overhunting? Because it always seemed to me to be an odd explanation for why these animals went extinct, is that we hunted them into extinction. But
yeah, there's a lot of debate about all that as well. I mean, there's been about 3 or 4 major theories, and the oldest one is just climate change. That you're coming out of the Ice Age, you're going into what's called the Holocene, the modern environment. It's warming up.
Like 12,900 years ago was this period.
You think of the Younger Dryas,
is
the period of there was a cold snap that occurred. Things started to warm up, and then you had this brief cold snap called the Younger Dryas, which occurred about 12,800, 12,900 years ago. And we're not sure, we can't see in the archaeological record that it affected people that much, although that's kind of the time of Clovis populations, and maybe some of this hunting changed. And it might have affected some of the animals, but we know, and paleontologists have told us that some of these Ice Age animals were already either extinct or going extinct by this time. So humans are not the sole explanation, the human hunting of these animals, but I believe they did have an impact on maybe some of the later animals to go extinct, maybe like the mammoth and mastodon,
Uh-huh.
and a few others. And we do have some evidence for hunting those. We actually did a study a few years ago on a giant ground sloth, a Jefferson's ground sloth.
Oh, I read that as one of your works too.
Where we found it was an animal bone that actually had this large creature, like weighed a ton, and a huge sloth that could stand up on its hind legs and had huge claws and was a plant eater.
Is that what's on your desk there? Is that the?
Yeah, someone gave me a little model of a ground sloth. But this one actually had cut marks. There were stone tool cut marks on the thigh bone that were pretty. I worked with a colleague in Canada, Haskell Greenfield, and he in Manitoba, and basically he's an expert on looking at cuts on bone and determining are they made from metal or stone tools, and he pretty much determined, yeah, those are stone tool cut marks. We dated the bone to about 12,700 years ago, so it's back to the Paleo-Indian, 13,700, which actually it's the oldest, if you want to call that an artifact, it's the oldest artifact in Ohio, the oldest dated butchered bone, for example.
And where was that found?
That was found in Huron County.
Oh, okay.
In north central Ohio. There's a very interesting, weird story about how that came about, but it was found maybe 10 years or more ago by a guy named Matt Burr in the attic of the Firelands Historical Society Museum in Norwalk. So Matt was a member of the board, and he was up cleaning up the attic, and he ran across this cardboard box in the corner, and it had a bunch of bones in it, big bones. And he looked at that, and Matt is kind of an amateur archaeologist and collector, and he's read about these things, and I think he thought, those don't look like deer bones. I mean, those are big bones. And apparently there was a scrap of paper in there that said, like, mastodon. And that was about all it was. And they had a little bit about, found in Huron County, and a little more information. And he looked at the bones, and among the bones were these big claw-like things. These what they're called unguals. On these animals, it's the last digit on the paws and the fingers, and it's the core for the claw that grows out there. Because they have big claws. He goes, now I know mastodon didn't have big claws like that. So he actually took some pictures. He actually wrote a little short article in a collector magazine called Ohio Archaeologist, which I see and a lot of professionals look at. And it just seemed curious. And he showed a picture of this bone with these look like cut marks. The problem with the whole thing is they have almost no information about where exactly this was found, when it was found, who dug it up. It wasn't done by professionals. And I saw the picture, and I remember thinking, it must be... Actually, I didn't see the magazine. What I did is I went, just by accident, circumstances, I went and a year or two later after that article came out, I talked to Matt Burr at one of my lectures or something, and he said, you should come see my artifact collection someday. He lives out near Bellevue, Ohio. And so I said, sure, and I went there on a Saturday, and I spent the whole morning looking at his arrowheads and his stone tools and talking about it and everything else, and I think we had lunch there and everything. It was very nice. And at the end he goes, I want to show you a picture of one other thing, and he brings out this black and white print of the picture that was in the magazine of this thigh bone, what we call the femur of this sloth, and you could see these kind of parallel incisions, cut marks, grooves on it. And he looked at it and he said he thinks that may be evidence for butchering. And I remember looking at it and thinking, oh no, come on. Where'd this come from? Well, we don't know. Who dug it up? We don't know. It was maybe in the 1800s. And I'm thinking, well, those are shovel marks. Those are marks from...
Sure.
It was found in some bog, and they might have been draining the bog, as most of these things are found accidentally. And it's probably just cuts in recent time. But he goes, you want to see it? I said, yeah. So he was on the board of the society, so he took me over. He had the keys to the research center in Norwalk, so he took me over and he pulled out this bone and showed it to me. And I kept looking at it, and I thought, those look like cut marks, but they got to be metal marks, metal tool marks, recent time. And so I said, could we borrow this? And the society loaned it to us for 2 years. And I just kept being intrigued by these things and saying, is there any chance they could be stone tool cut marks? Because again, no one's ever documented that on these sloths.
Yeah.
And so we studied it for 2 years. We did latex peels and molds of it, and sent them to Haskell Greenfield, and he did some SEM work, really studied them closely, and again his determination of, no, these are stone tool cut marks, and these are butchering marks. And by the end of it, we ended up publishing an article, a bunch of us, including Matt Burr, on our analysis of this, and I think we made a pretty good case. And I think through some historic research I was doing with Matt that I think I know where they came from. I think there's a little bog out in Huron County where I'm pretty sure it came from.
Right.
So we kind of put some of the history together, reconstructed that as best we can. So it became this really neat project of archaeology, paleontology, and then just history. But it's still the first documented butchered Jefferson's ground sloth
Amazing.
that's been documented.
Yeah.
So that's another animal species that now we know humans were hunting, at least in a limited way.
Right. So around that time, you had a. I mean, did it look similar to like an African savanna where you had a lot of these giant animals just wandering around with human populations hunting them? I mean, were we looking at giant sloths and mastodon and like saber-toothed tiger and that kind of thing?
There's no like saber-tooth type cats, I think, that have been fossils in Ohio.
Yeah.
But they've been found from surrounding states. So that one we can't say, but we definitely have short-faced bear bones. We have a lot of these what are called flat-headed peccary, which is probably the most common Ice Age animal. It was an Ice Age pig-like animal. It actually wasn't related to the European pig. It's more like related to modern peccaries who live in Mexico, northern Mexico, and the Southwest. But they're little animals now. This flat-headed peccary was about as big as a deer.
Okay.
With really long legs and big tusks, and they ran around in herds, and sometimes they would die in herds because they find them all over North America,
Right.
including Ohio. So that was there's a lot of those.
Why would they die in herds? How does
Well,
that
out
happen?
west, there's actually some sites where apparently they got in the middle of a dust storm and they got buried in a sand
Oh,
dune.
shit.
I mean, there's a neat
Yeah,
article
right.
out there, and it shows this black and white shot of all these peccary kind of crouched down. They're probably on the far side of a sand dune to
Right.
get out of the wind, but apparently the whole thing collapsed, and they were in like a line.
Oh, wow.
And they're all preserved, these little skeletons of these animals. And so yeah, and then we actually worked at a site called Sheridan Cave back in 1997 out near Findlay, Ohio.
Okay.
And this is an Ice Age cave that was found at the bottom of a sinkhole by the landowner. And that's a whole nother story you can read about. But it's we worked there for one season with students from Kent State University and Dr. Ken Tankersley, who was one of my colleagues. And we did excavations in the cave and outside the cave. And it was just filled with Ice Age animal bones. And it actually had been done earlier by a paleontologist named Greg McDonald. And it was a paleontology site. But during the time of some of the earlier excavations, and when the cave was opened by the landowner, he found some artifacts. He found a couple bone spear points one in the cave, and then the volunteers working with us later actually found another one. So there's a handful of tools in the cave. But the point is, it's filled with, we probably pulled out maybe 10,000 animal bones from this cave.
Wow.
And Cincinnati, where Greg McDonald worked, has another 10 or 20,000 of them. So it documents this Ice Age life pretty completely. And there is short-faced bear. There's lots of peccary. Let's see what else is out there. Giant beaver, which was a beaver as big as a black bear that was around in the Ice Age. And then a lot of small animal species. And there were like Holocene species, deer bones. There was even things like owl pellets with little rodent bones in them that the owls probably flew in. What this was in 13,000 years ago was a sinkhole that was an old underground cavern passage that collapsed. And then at the bottom, the rest of the cavern turned into this cave that got filled up with sediment because it was open to the sky. But animals would fall down into this sinkhole. It was a natural trap.
Oh, okay, I get it.
And they die down there, and then they would get probably washed back into the cave, and it's covered with this really rich organic dark sediment almost to the top of when it was open, it was almost to the top of the little cave at the back of the cavern there. But again, these artifacts were way tucked back in an area as big as this table we're sitting at, about 3 feet across, in the back of the cave, just kind of sitting there among all these animal bones. And so we thought, as archaeologists, what does this mean by people?
Right.
We know they were there, but what were they doing there? Curiously, we've looked at all these animal bones a couple times. I had other paleontologists. Greg McDonald came and looked at them and ID'd all the species for us. And almost none show evidence of cut marks or butchering marks. Some are burned, but that could occur by natural fires, wildfires, and things that fall down into this passage. That could be natural. And so we have these now 2 complete spear points, a small Clovis point, a little miniature that's back there, and then a big flint hide scraping tool. that was found way at the back of the cave early on when it was first opened, all in the same area, way at the back of the cave. And we kept thinking, what are these? Why are these back here? And they're all pristine. I mean, they're not chipped or broken.
Right.
So they didn't fall in the sinkhole, as we thought at first, and got blown or washed back to the back. I think they were put back there, and I think they were attached to, they were complete weapons.
Mm-hmm.
They had wooden spear shafts or handles attached to them that is now decayed. So why would people leave a handful of weaponry, hunting weapons in the back of the cave and processing tools like the hide scraper? Well, it could be that they were camping in there. They were stopping off. It might have been like an open rock shelter. They could come down and get into there and
Thinking there was another entrance somewhere.
yeah,
where they could,
or
okay.
just or they saw that sometimes animals fall down the sinkhole, and if we come back every once in a while, there may be a peccary down there or something we
Right.
can kill and butcher it. And it could be that, but it's hard, archaeologically to prove that. And again, there's no butchered bone down there. So if they did that, they hauled the thing out and butchered it somewhere else. But there's another explanation, which I think to me makes a lot more sense, is that I think these objects may have been deliberately placed back in the cave, possibly as an offering. We know historically, with Native Americans all over North America, that places like rock shelters and caves were seen by a lot of groups as entrances to the underworld, or where the dead souls would go. Out west, there's cave sites where in the entrance there's burials. They made cemeteries out of them. And it was seen like a place where you could enter or commune with the underworld or the place of the dead. And sometimes, a lot of historic records of Indians, shooting arrows into these caves as offerings, or to deal with the spirits or something like that. So it may be that even 13,000 years ago, people were putting these objects in the back of the cave
Right.
as an offering, because it just looks like someone put them back there and then walked away.
Yeah.
So, but what's interesting too is, from our discussion, is that there's all these Ice Age animals, but they weren't there to hunt them and kill them. There's really no evidence of that.
Right.
Well, we have one bone that has a chop mark on it, and it's not an Ice Age animal. It's the neck bone of a snapping turtle.
Huh.
One snapping
Right.
turtle. And if you caught a snapping turtle, what's the first thing you would do if you want to eat it?
Well,
Cut
yeah,
its
you
head
gotta
off.
cut the head off so you don't get bit.
Exactly. Dispatch it that way. So it may have been, that may be evidence of somebody having a meal. And there are little charcoal concentrate. They might have had little fires occasionally. So it could have
Right.
been both a stopping off point, and maybe they cached or left their spears there to come back later, although I think that'd be kind of risky. But it also could be a place where these offerings were placed.
And talking about that, I was reading that the Native Americans had a system similar to what you see in a lot of cultures, even in the Norse culture, where you have this tree of life, kind of 3 different levels of different realms.
Yes. Yeah, the 3 worlds. That's common across the globe. I mean, it's really amazing. And again, historic, recorded Native American belief systems. I mean, most groups ascribe to something having an underworld, an earth world, or the world we live on, and then the upper world.
Right.
And a lot of their ceremony and rituals were tied to, tying those realms together, and making sacred places spots for performing rituals and important ceremonies. And sometimes it involved putting a pole up.
Okay, so that was the one in, was it Erie County that you?
Yeah, the Heckelman site.
Right. I was
Yeah.
reading about that this morning. So
Yeah.
if you'd talk about that one a little bit.
Yeah, that's another interesting place. I've been very fortunate to have a lot of really good
Yeah.
projects, some which drop in our lap, like the sloth. But the Heckelman site's a site on a private farm out near Milan, Ohio, in Erie County, on the Huron River. It's on a bluff top overlooking the river. We've probably now done about 7 seasons of work out there, and done excavations in different parts of the site, but we spent a number of years working in the eastern part of the site, and it's situated on this high bluff top overlooking the river with these steep kind of shale cliffs on the sides and cut by ravines. And what's interesting in northern Ohio, when you look at things we call earthworks or enclosures, they're often on these really conspicuous landforms where they're building or they're digging ditches, the Indians, to enclose. You'd imagine something as a promontory that on 3 sides has steep cliffs, and then there's a flat part you enter from the main ridge. Mm-hmm. They were putting ditches across there and probably earthworks, earthen walls. And for many years, these things were called forts, and people thought they were little, defensive positions of the Native Americans. And fighting another group or something like that, and that they needed to build these fortifications. But that never made a lot of sense to a lot of people that know about military strategy and fortifications. And we also pretty well think that warfare back in before Europeans came was pretty much like raiding behavior. They weren't storming citadels, and they weren't building huge defense works, and at least not at this time. And this is like about 300 BC we're talking. Anyway, Heckelman was another one of these sites that we learned eventually. We did a number of different types of studies, geophysical surveys, and looked below the ground with magnetometers and other instruments, and then we did excavations in different parts. But what it turned up is that this site was also being used, part of it, as a ritual enclosure, where they dug 2 parallel ditches across the neck of this promontory to close off this big rectangular piece that had steep sides on it. And then they also dug a big oval-shaped enclosure, which would have been about 60 feet across. And we excavated inside this oval-shaped enclosure to find lots of evidence of people setting up these large poles or posts, kind of these freestanding poles, and probably, again, relating to the same kind of rituals that, again, we see historically, tying up the upper world and the earth world and the underworld together. And apparently they would dig these, they would dig holes, set them up, and then they would take them out. And over there next to it, they might put another one in, maybe the next year, maybe the next ceremonial they had. Because there's this interior of this enclosure is dotted with these little clusters of these, we call post molds. And some are rather big. Some are 1.5 feet across, these holes, these filled holes. Yeah. And they go down, some go down almost 3 feet. So they were setting up some big, tall posts there, temporarily using them, performing rituals around them, and then taking them back down again. And I read some other people have studied these kind of sites and similar sites in the Hopewell area in southern Ohio and other places. And they talk about, if you look not just at the middle of a site like we were doing, but you step back and look at the whole landform, this promontory sticking out with water running around the entire circumference, because Heckelman has a creek ravine on the north side. It intersects with a creek going south, which would be on its east side. Then you have the bluff edge to the Huron River on the south side, and the Huron River was below that. So if you back out and look at a map, you see there's water going around 3 sides of this. And then you have these 2 parallel ditches they dug, which probably in the spring would have filled with water. And actually there are springs that come out right below the bluff where these things end. They probably were symbolic of a water barrier or a ghost barrier that historic people talk about. Some groups believe that spirits couldn't cross water. So if you're doing something important, maybe relates to the spirits of the dead or ceremonies honoring the ancestors inside these enclosures, perhaps they wanted some kind of at least symbolic water barrier around it to keep in the spirits. I mean, a lot of Native peoples believe that, the ancestors, we think of our ancestors fondly and, we respect them, and they did too, but they also knew that in their beliefs, spirits of the dead sometimes could cause trouble for people. Right. And you had to be very careful how you dealt with them. That they were still alive in the world to some degree, and you had to perform certain rituals and honor them. And maybe it's either they didn't want the interaction with the spirits to get out from that enclosure, or they didn't want other things coming in. Again, archaeology can't prove any of those specifically. Sure. But the whole circumstances of the site, the landform where it's positioned, the water barriers around it, and what we found inside really point to this being not a village site, not an everyday living site, but probably an important ritual center in that area.
And are we looking at different tribal groups coming together to do this, or would it be for one group?
It's hard to, again, we can't say for sure. It could have been, it's the whole interior of the enclosure is about an acre, acre and a half, so it's not huge. It's not like some of the ones in southern Ohio are enclosed hundreds of acres. Okay. Those might have been multiple tribal groups coming together from all over a huge area. I think this is a smaller scale. It could have been maybe a couple tribal groups, but it also could have been the next, people living in a village downriver. Sure. Or on the Sandusky River nearby, or neighboring groups that they interacted with. Maybe all spoke the same language. Probably coming there, and probably as family groups, kin groups coming, maybe just a clan group used that spot. Right. Because there are others of these. Just you go upriver about half a mile. There's another one of these called Seaman's Fort that's been studied by the University of Toledo for a number of years. It's similarly set up. It's the same kind of thing. And on most of the rivers running through northern Ohio, they go from south to north into the lake, from Conneaut Creek on the east at the Pennsylvania line, almost all to Toledo and beyond. on most of the major rivers, there's one or two of these, what we call hilltop enclosures.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of them in the Cuyahoga Valley that have been recorded. And some are just, they have plowed down. You can see the earthen walls still. We can't see them at Heckelman, they're gone. But at some of these, you can see these little low earthen walls bordering just these swales that's left of the ditches. And I always tell people the best place to go if you want to see one of these is Indian Point Park in the Lake Metro Parks near Paynesville.
Okay.
That has the best preserved hilltop enclosure there. The earthworks are still about 3 to 4 feet high. The ditches are the same. They're blatantly obvious.
Right.
And you park in this parking lot, this upper parking lot at Indian Point Park, and you walk back this wonderful trail through this beautiful eastern hemlock forest, overlooking the Grand River, so you get these beautiful views of the river. And then you walk to this point. It goes out to a point, and halfway down the point, you see there's 2 ditches and 2 embankments. And that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But almost every other site, those are either gone, filled in, or just little remnants of what was there. So people can go see these things, and that's the best one to see.
I'm going to drag my family out to that one for sure.
And it's just a great outing when the weather's nice to go see that. Another one that if you're on the West Siders,
that's
where I live, there's Fort Hill in the Rocky River Reservation of the Cleveland Metro Parks.
Oh,
where the Interpretive Center is in North Olmsted there. If you've ever been there, there's a wonderful interpretive center, and then there's this big wooden stairway that goes up. You can walk up to the top of this bluff, and that's one of these triangular points, what's left of it. And on the top there's 3 earthen embankments and ditches, which are not as high as the ones at Indian Point, but you can still see them.
Yeah.
You can still kind of see them a little bit. I did a Twitter post a few weeks ago on our Twitter account for our department, CMNH Archaeology, and of some pictures. I was up there a few months ago and took some pictures. But it's a nice place to visit. But you can get the idea, and you can see some of the ditches, and there's an informational plaque there that you can read about the site.
And these are sites like the one in Erie County that are more you think are more religious in nature, kind of.
I think they're not forts. They're not strategic. Now, most have evidence of people coming back at later times. So again, most of these date around 300 to let's say 1 BC. Mm-hmm. It's called our early woodland period, is what we call it. They were used later. Later peoples came back. At Heckelman, people came back and built a whole village on top of this place at about 1400 AD. So there's a lot of reoccupation. And maybe later people were making these things into villages. Mm-hmm. Can't say for sure. But when they were built and constructed, I think the purpose was as a ceremonial place.
Yeah. And the one in Lorain County is the Burl Orchard site. Is that something similar to that? Or?
Well, Burl Orchard, the site, you mentioned in Sheffield Village, it's now in the Lorain County Metro Parks, and it is an open site. It did not have, best we can tell, it wasn't an earthen enclosure site. Now we think it was a habitation site, but one of the oldest that we know about. But across the road is Burl Fort, mm-hmm. which is another one of these hilltop enclosures that I think it has 2 earthen walls and ditches. You can still actually see those if you go to the French Creek Reservation in the Lorain Metro Parks. You can walk back. It used to be marked, but if you back in the woods and take this one trail, you can see it.
See, I've been through there a million times. I had no idea it was back there.
Yeah, it's like a little branch off there. Actually, a little an area of the trail. They stopped a lot of people from going through there because it was getting eroded.
Uh-huh.
But it's still, if you know where it is, it's accessible. And that's another one of these. But Burl Orchard is across the street, and that's a much older site. That's not, there's ceremonialism, but it's not a hilltop enclosure.
Yeah. So what's next on the horizon? Are you got anything big in the works around here?
Well, we're still working at Heckelman, actually.
Mm-hmm.
We went back the last 2 seasons. We're going to go again this summer. We do 4 weeks of field excavations every year, and we're going to go back, and we're actually working on what we found there. The site constantly surprises me because we worked 5 summers on the eastern end of this Heckelman site, on this promontory where we found all these things I just described. And we never figured out how big the site was, because this isn't a huge field on this bluff top owned by a private farmer and these landowners have been absolutely fantastic.
Sure.
Giving us access to the site. They let us dig in their crops. Right. I mean, it's just amazing. And we couldn't do this without private landowners that understand what we do and are cooperative and want to learn about these sites and also preserve them. So anyway, it's a huge site. It's, this property is probably 50 acres or more, and we did some work. We decided to go back. We finished at 2013 on the eastern end of the site, and then we went to this Burl Orchard site for a while. Then we came back in 2017 and decided to do a magnetic survey. We hire an archaeologist, a guy named Jared Burks, and Jared's an expert in what's called geophysical survey. And this basically involves a number of instruments now that archaeologists use to look below the surface without digging, essentially.
Right.
The most common one is
penetrating radar.
there's ground penetrating radar. Most people have heard of that, but there's a number of magnetic survey type magnetometers that are used, which actually work really well in northern Ohio. And basically, it looks for changes in the soil caused by a lot of things, including people digging cooking pits and storage pits, and what the Indians did to the ground. And digging ditches for enclosures show up really well.
Right.
So we've had Jared do surveys initially on the eastern side of the site, and then in 2016, he came out and went west to where we'd worked. We'd never done anything out there, and it's this big flat open field. And I had him do a survey over 6 acres out there, and I thought maybe he'll find another ditched enclosure, but no, there wasn't any of those. But he found evidence of a whole area, probably another 3 or 4 acres that are covered by what are probably storage pits and cooking pits and things like that. So the site is like twice as large now as we thought in 2015.
So a lot more work to be done.
Yeah, so we went back the last 2 seasons, and one thing we found in the magnetic data, and if you look at these things, it looks like a Rorschach blot test or something. It's usually these gray shaded maps with dark black things and then white spots and then gray background, and it's, if you stare at it too much, it gets blurry.
Right.
And you can see it, you can make anything you want out of some of those, but Jared knows how to look at the readings from individual, what he calls anomalies, which are disturbances in the soil. And we actually did the survey in 2016, and he's in Columbus, so that night he stayed at my house. And we came back to the house, and then he downloaded all his data. He records it with his instrument and then downloads it. So he has to make these maps. And we're sitting there at my dining room table, and he's looking at these maps generated. So we're sitting there watching these things come up, looking for something. And I kind of looked, I thought, I see some black spots, which are probably pits and this and that. And he goes, oh, look at that. And I said, what are you talking about? And he looks, he goes, you see it? See it there? And I said, what are you talking about? And he goes, that circle. And you look close, and if he points it out, there's this circular anomaly. It looks like a light-colored outline of a perfect circle on there. And I thought, what the heck is that? And it wasn't huge. It was about 20 meters, like 60 feet across, okay? He goes, well, that could be a plowed-away mound, or that could be a wooden post circle, what's called a wood henge, which is historically in the pre-contact era, lots of people at different times built enclosures of wooden posts. Not like our little scattered clusters we found at Heckelman, but actually a circle of wooden posts that are set up in the ground. And they've been found in southern Ohio on Hopewell sites, Adena sites, under mounds and things. But they've never been documented in northern Ohio. And so the last 2 seasons we went out to excavate on top of that, what's called ground truthing, where we want to see, is what he saw in his mag map, is that really there?
Right.
And sometimes they're not. Sometimes you have these beautiful anomalies, you dig and there's nothing there.
Right.
It probably was a burned rock or something in the plow zone that did that, because burned rocks can do that. But so we excavated the last 2 seasons, and we actually found, we did document post-mold lines of a circle. They're about, they're only about 20 centimeters in diameter, these post molds. But they're pretty regular, and they follow this arcing pattern. And we found it on a couple different parts of what would be the circle. We couldn't dig the whole thing, and we don't have time to do that. But I just wanted to, can we find enough of post molds where that circle is on the map?
Right.
And we did. And then in the middle, we found this big pit feature. It's probably 2 meters across, so it's half as big as this room. And it had these posts set really deep, more than a meter down below the surface, more than 3 feet deep. They were setting these large posts up right in the middle of the circle. And again, it harkens back to these historic accounts of Native Americans building these circles and enclosures and then having a central post. Again, to connect these worlds together. Right. I think that's what it is. It's a ceremonial enclosure, but not like the ditch thing that we saw earlier. It's a little bit different type of thing. And then we found some what are called earth ovens, cooking pits associated with that. One had Hopewell artifacts in it. So it had types of stone tools that are only made by these Hopewell mound building peoples in southern Ohio.
You think that's evidence of trading, or that
Well, I
maybe they
think it
came
means
up?
that, well, and as it turns out, and actually the reason we went to Heckelman originally is because some artifact collectors had published some things years ago in the 60s about finding what are called bladelets, these colorful flint bladelets that are very typical of southern Ohio, but they were finding them at this Heckelman site. So we kind of knew there was some Hopewell thing going on there, but nobody understood what was it. Is it migration? Is it people moving? What's going on? Is it trade going on? Why do you have these classic Hopewell artifacts? Well, some have been found, but this is kind of the first time we have them in context. So we found some bladelets. We found pieces of sheet mica, which they were using to make ornaments. Really direct evidence of a Hopewell occupation. And now I'm leaning to the idea that this circle of posts was put up by Hopewell-inspired or cultured people, again dating to what we call our Middle Woodland period.
Uh-huh.
And it's the first one documented in northern Ohio, and we're still trying to completely understand what it is.
Right.
But next to it, going farther west, the magnetometer survey showed us a whole huge area of pit features, and we're going to start testing some of that this summer. Because the question I have is, okay, so they have these ceremonial enclosures on the east side, they have these post circles on the west end. What else are they doing? What are they doing there? Are they living there? Is that a village? It's a big area. We're finding evidence
Seems
of
like
them
it's
living.
a huge area that they're
Or
using.
is it a little like what you see in southern Ohio? They don't have any big villages for Hopewell people. They have little hamlets, they call them, 1 or 2 houses where people are living there. They're very spread out and not really nomadic, but they tend to move seasonally different places, and then they would stop and do a little farming of squash and gourds and some seed plants. But it wasn't a settled village type setup, and that was always kind of the weird thing about Hopewell. People found these great earthworks, but they couldn't find villages.
Right.
So is that what's going on here? So we're going to start testing this large area of cultural remains to see if there's Hopewell houses there, middle woodland houses with more permanent residents versus just short-term living. And that's a big interest we've had in that site ever since we learned about this Heckelman site with Hopewell artifacts. So all this other stuff we find was unexpected. The late prehistoric villages and the early woodland enclosure and all that stuff.
Do you see any evidence from the people around here or in any of your research that the people had any kind of interest or maybe guided by what they saw in the stars? Were they mapping this on the surface anywhere? Were they into astronomy kind of things? Were they looking at different?
Right. A lot of that's done. People study that with the Hopewell culture, for example, and looking at like solar alignments and lunar alignments, and people that we call archaeoastronomers are people that are astronomically trained and know about celestial events and alignments and things, go and study these sites. And some of the big sites in southern Ohio, like at Newark, Ohio, and Chillicothe area, they have these big enclosures, and some have been seen to be deliberately built and aligned with, the summer solstice or the winter solstice sunrise and things like that. It's very possible that some of these things we're finding are the same, but it's not really my expertise. I played around with it, looking at some alignments, even with this post circle and things. And the trouble with a post circle, you can make any alignment you want, right? Pick a post and stand in the middle, and you say, okay, that aligns to this, but this one doesn't, this one doesn't. Oh, that one does. Well, is that real? But these people had a keen knowledge about celestial events. They knew about the solstices, they knew about the winter solstice and the beginning of winter, the end of winter, the length of the days, the time of planting, and very likely, they might have set some of these things out aligning with that. And I think with further work and a little more excavation, I think we'll be able to test some of those questions as well.
Well, you figure, first of all, the ability to see the night sky would have been much greater without
for sure,
all the surface lights interrupting, and other than staring at fire, it was probably the next most available thing to examine.
And all cultures were like that because we don't pay attention to the sky and we can't see it half the time.
It's amazing to me. I go out with take the dog out, and I live right on Lake Erie, and so we get a little bit more stars than normal, and just amazing to me when you look up there and just can see everything so clearly. And you got to think that it was just a great form of entertainment when there was no surface lights.
Well, yeah. I mean, it'd be spectacular. And what I always try to, what I'm learning and trying to bring into my research is this whole perception of what did these folks think and what was their experience like and when they were around. And again, by analogy to modern Native Americans and traditional groups, we know that their worldview was very different than ours. They saw everything as alive, that it wasn't just humans. Humans were the only sentient beings, that other animals had levels of awareness. And there were spirits, non-human entities that lived out there, and they lived in the rocks, and they lived in, some people believed that some certain kind of pottery had spirits to it itself. They'd give them names. Some people believe that, the stones themselves, certain kinds of stones could hear you talking, and you had to be careful what you said. And they were very aware of that. And if you think about living in a world, have a worldview where you believe everything's alive, and things are listening to you,
yeah,
and can affect your life, and if you don't, say the proper prayers or make offerings, for example, a lot of groups in the woodlands believed about a forest guardian spirit. And different groups, Iroquois and others, have depictions of them. It's this kind of humanoid type figure has deer antlers, and he rides around on a deer, and they call the master of animals. And basically, at night, he brings all the animals into his realm, which is often inside rock faces and things. And then during the day, he releases them out. And if you want to successfully hunt a deer, you basically have to make it known, and you have to make maybe offerings or prayers to this spirit. And if you're able to shoot and kill a deer, it's because that spirit let it happen.
Right.
Or the deer decided to give up its life.
Right.
And you think about that, and you think, what if your whole perception of the world was like that? And when you walk through the forest, you think everything's alive and listening. And there's some malevolent spirits. I mean, there's some things that can hurt me or cause me trouble or affect my children if I don't do the right thing.
Yeah.
And there's others that can help me. And to survive in this world, I have to enlist the aid of these, non-human persons, as they call them. And, the more I thought about that, you have to have something in the back of your mind when you look at these archaeological remains. You can't look at them as just a Western.
Sure.
Oh, that's a cooking pit.
Right.
That's all it is. Well, the cooking pit that we found, they made their fire, they cooked their food. It's full of broken, burned rocks and some wood. Well, they also put this cluster, we found a cluster of semi-burned deer bones sitting on the top of the fill of this earth oven. We took that off, and there were these pieces of silver mica sitting underneath, silver-colored. It's a sheet rock from the Appalachians. It's a transparent rock. They were important to a lot of people sitting there. And then there were a couple of these flint ridge bladelets. I mean, these were put in there as an offering or something, a deposit after they used this earth oven, which might have been used to cook food for a feast or communal meal, related maybe to this post enclosure, something like that. So there's all these dimensions to these things.
Yeah.
And to try to get what we think is useful information out of these, you have to, at least for me, I have to try to look at them in a different context.
Get inside their head a little bit.
And I'm afraid traditionally in archaeology, we haven't done that. I think we've missed so much.
Yeah,
it isn't really just what did they eat, what did their tools, how did they make their tools. It's what are the other more ephemeral parts of their environment that they could perceive. Why did they build an enclosure on this bluff top? It probably is some kind of orientation.
Yeah.
And something maybe do with the river and the rock faces and a three-dimensional model, of the universe or something.
The other thing you're probably dealing with is landscape changing over the years too, and what did it look like hundreds, if not thousands of years
Especially
ago?
Vegetation cover and things like that. And what was it like back then? Was it more open? Was it grassy area? A little pocket prairie, something like that. Maybe that's where they built it here because it was open. Did he cut all the trees down? Things like that. And environmentally, that consider the climate and things like that as well. So,
yeah, it's an interesting point that you have to kind of put yourself in their shoes when you're looking at this, and it would make a lot of sense. It would be a way of opening your eyes a little bit to this stuff instead of just, like you said, just passing over it.
Yeah.
I don't know. And you think about these ancient religions or ancient schools of thought, and they all sound ridiculous until we look at modern religions and see the crazy things we do in God's name or Allah's name or whoever. But I don't know that they're that much crazier than anything we look at nowadays.
Well, yeah, and some seem really odd to us, and we'd call it paganism or
Yeah.
Shamanism related things. But the funny thing is, if you look at human history, the vast majority of our human history, everybody was a hunter-gatherer, right? All our ancestors, everybody's ancestors lived that way. And they probably all had much more common worldview. In fact, this whole universal model of these three worlds, that's across the globe. That's not just in the Americas.
Absolutely, yeah, that's what I've seen in a lot of things.
Which kind of blows me away when I think about that. And then even this idea of this master of animals, deity or spirit god or whatever, that shows up in artifacts from the Middle East.
Yeah.
Same idea, that
Right.
there's some spirit that controls the wild animals, and what's out there are the potential resources for people, and you have to deal with that. You can't just say, I'm a great hunter, I'm good, because if the animal doesn't want you to kill it, it's not going to let
Right.
you. That's, again, a totally different way of looking at it, but it's almost a universal thing in humanity. It's not just at the Heckelman site or the Burl
Right.
Orchard site. It's something that is been around a lot longer than the way we look at the world.
Well, I think if you spoke to anyone who's gone hunting or is big into hunting, it would almost seem logical to think that something is helping you get that
I think
deer.
hunters understand
You know.
this more than a lot of people.
Right, because I know guys who that's their whole life and will go out a whole season and not get one, and then their wife will go out the next season and get one the first day.
Right.
So can't just be that
Yeah.
I'm not as good a hunter as she is. There must be something helping this along.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that I believe there's a master of animals out
Well,
there
sure,
controlling
sure.
this, but I can understand why that would be part of your worldview.
Right.
When you don't have some of the things we have to give other explanations, But there's a lot about animal behavior we don't know. There's scientists now that say different animals might be more sentient, a little more aware than we think.
Right.
We always thought humans are completely conscious, self-conscious, and everything else is dead,
Right.
robots. And a lot of, even on fish, I've read things about that fish might have feelings and fish might experience pain, and and there's different levels of that.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to learn as time goes on that we're not as unique as we think, and we have to look even at animals around us differently.
I agree with you 100%. My wife is a big believer in that, and that she talks about that all the time. That maybe because there's so much noise now as opposed to back then, we're missing out on a lot of things. Like they knew things we didn't just because they were more focused and more in tune with what was going on around them and the animals and the plants.
Because they had to be.
Yeah, right.
We would die. Right. We can go to the supermarket, we can get our food, and we can work and bring a paycheck home and get what we need. We can be detached pretty much from nature, right?
Right.
But if you got to live in the middle of that, just to survive,
Right.
what your ancestors have taught you about how to live and where to get the fish at this season and where to get the berries, where to get the nuts, and hopefully they'll be there when you get there again next year. Famine is a common thing. People die from starvation in those contexts because sometimes things don't work out.
Yeah.
You get a blizzard and it wipes everything out. So you have to be aware of that, just the practicalities of survival. But then again, if you add this whole other dimension to what's out there, that it's looking back at you, that it has its own agenda, it has its own spirits and things that control it, and you're just an entity that has to function within that. You're not the top of the food chain,
Sure.
right? You got to deal with that, because if you don't, you're going to have a lot of trouble.
I think we still have hunter-gatherers societies that are probably very similar to what
Yeah,
you're
they're
dealing with.
diminishing really quickly.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're there was more back in the 60s. Anthropologists started living with the Kung Bushmen of the Kalahari, and then Aboriginal peoples in Australia were getting a lot of.
I read a book, Keep the River on Your Left, I think it was,
yeah, I've
where the
heard of
guy
that,
went
yeah.
down and lived with cannibals down in
Yeah,
South America. It was
yeah. Unfortunately, almost all those groups have been contacted, and a lot of their cultures unfortunately diminished, and
Right.
disease and things. But yeah, there's been enough recorded that they know that those worldviews extended into the historic period.
Yeah.
And it's funny, if you read these early European accounts from the 1800s when they encountered these people, and they just think, they're chanting some gibberish, and they're doing why they're dancing around a pole. These heathens, what's wrong with them?
Right.
We got to convert them. And what they're actually viewing is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
What we're digging up now. And just think if you could add a real anthropologist there to say, let's look at. I'd love to have seen a working post circle.
Right.
Right. Well, how did they
instead
actually
of-
build this? And were these posts carved? And were they painted? And what did they do with them? All things we can't tell from
Yeah.
archaeology. we kind of lost that because the people that came first didn't understand these cultures and couldn't see these.
They were
things.
actively trying to get rid of
Well,
them
that too.
'cause
Either
of the religion.
change them or
Right.
get rid of them. Right.
Yeah, some of the stuff down. We went to Mexico last year and went down to Tulum and saw some of these ancient ruins down there. And I was reading some stuff about Hernan Cortez
Mm-hmm.
going down there and just wiping out these civilizations. And not that Montezuma was a much better human, but
No,
pretty
they.
amazing.
Yeah, but it was a culture clash that
Yeah.
ended badly for Native peoples. And what as it turns out, what was the biggest factor was disease
Right.
that the Europeans didn't even understand at the time. The idea about germs and infection, and they had no clue. They thought God was killing these people off because
Right.
that's what he wanted. He wanted them to be in charge, but that wiped out more people than even ended up they were killed in battles and things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, and now they're realizing the depopulation was, in many parts of the New World, was maybe 80%, 80% or
Yeah,
more
that's insane.
of that culture. And some cultures completely disappeared. Languages disappeared. So much has been lost. And the surviving native peoples are really trying to preserve what they can. But even they have a hard time reconstructing, the full. It must have been an amazingly rich record of belief and
Right.
what they were doing. But yeah, disease was a primary factor.
Yeah. Amazing stuff. I want to thank you for having us out here today.
Sure.
I'd love to do it again sometime. And I definitely want to go check out. So I might be bending your ear a little bit to find out where I'm supposed to go to check out some of these
Sure.
sites. So
Yeah.
I want to thank you for coming on the show, and we'll do it again sometime.
All right.
Dr. Brian Redmond, thank you very much.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to the show today. Next week up on the show we will have Mike Beach, so make sure you check that one out. Mike was the one of the founding fathers of Hate Brand Gear, and now he is one of the founding fathers of Throw Bros. So real interesting interview, real interesting talk with that guy. Make sure you head on over to therefinedsavage.com and buy some gear. Support the show. We love you guys. See ya.